Hashtag part 1, sir. If you cannot afford priority boarding, you need to step out of the line. Daniel Hayes looked at the gate agent, then at the boarding pass in his hand. $110. That was what the ticket had cost after 3 weeks of comparing flights, shifting dates, and promising Emily that the long trip would still be worth it. We are in the right group, Daniel said calmly. The agent glanced at his faded brown jacket, then at the small backpack hanging from his shoulder. Group 6 boards last. I know. Behind Daniel, a businessman sighed loudly. Some of us have connections to make. Daniel stepped aside without arguing. Emily, 10 years old and carrying a purple backpack almost as large as her torso, looked up at him. Daddy, she was rude. Daniel lowered his voice. Being rude is her choice. Emily frowned. What is ours? How we answer. Across the airport, beyond 2 glass terminals and a private security gate, Victoria Sterling never heard the exchange. She was walking toward a Gulfstream jet worth $55 million. 3 assistants followed her. One carried legal folders. One held 2 phones. The third was explaining weather conditions over Montana. Victoria did not slow down. If Sterling Ridge is still losing money, we close it today. Her chief financial officer, Marcus Reed, kept pace beside her. 380 employees. I read the report. Some have been there 20 years. Victoria stopped. Her gray-blue eyes were cool, precise. We are not running a museum, Marcus. Then she continued toward the aircraft. The jet stairs gleamed beneath the morning sun. Inside waited cream leather seats, polished walnut, fresh coffee, and enough quiet to forget that airports were crowded places. Miles away in the same terminal complex, Daniel and Emily squeezed into seats 28B and 28C. The overhead bin was full. Daniel placed his backpack beneath his feet. Emily took the window. You said Montana has mountains everywhere. Not everywhere. Almost everywhere. He smiled. Enough for you to complain about taking pictures. The engines began to hum. Daniel turned toward the window. For just a moment, the smile disappeared. Montana. He had not been back in 8 years. Not since Laura. Not since Sterling Ridge. Not since he had packed one cardboard box, taken his daughter by the hand, and walked away from the only engineering job he had ever loved. Emily noticed. You are thinking about Mom. Daniel looked at her. How do you always know? You get quiet differently. He reached over and squeezed her hand. She made me promise something. What? Daniel looked toward the runway. I will tell you when we get there. At that same moment, Victoria Sterling's private jet lifted from another runway. She sat alone beside a window, reviewing a closure agreement. Sterling Ridge Aerospace Facility. Permanent shutdown authorization. Her signature line waited at the bottom. Victoria picked up her pen. Then Marcus placed an old technical report beside the contract. You should see this first. Victoria barely looked at it. What is it? The reason your father kept the facility open. She turned one page. A prototype engine. A handwritten correction. And beneath it, the name of an engineer who had disappeared from Sterling Aerospace 8 years earlier. Daniel Hayes. Victoria stared at the photograph clipped to the report. 40 minutes later, while her $55 million jet cut silently across the clouds, Daniel sat in economy, helping Emily open a packet of pretzels. Neither of them knew the other existed. Neither knew they were flying toward the same remote runway. And neither yet understood that one of them was traveling to bury Sterling Ridge forever, while the other was carrying the only reason it might deserve to survive. The cabin settled into the steady rhythm of flight, engines humming beneath the floor, while pale morning light spilled across the rows. Emily pressed her forehead to the window. Do you think Mom liked flying? Daniel looked at her. She hated turbulence. Really? She would grip the armrest and pretend she was fine. Emily smiled. Like you do when you are worried? Daniel gave her a look. I do not worry. You reorganized our boarding passes 4 times. Before he could answer, a soft chime sounded overhead. A flight attendant stepped into the aisle near row 27, crouching beside an older passenger whose reading light had stopped working. It keeps flickering, the man said. Then the call button stopped too. The attendant tried the panel twice. Nothing. Daniel watched for a moment, then leaned slightly into the aisle. Excuse me. She looked over. Yes, sir. The panel probably is not the problem. I am sorry. If both functions failed together, check the connector behind the service trim. It may have shifted. The attendant blinked. You work on aircraft? Daniel paused. I used to work around them. She hesitated, then called another crew member. A few minutes later, after a quick inspection, the reading light came back on. The older passenger smiled. You called that from 3 rows away? Daniel shrugged. Old habit. Emily beamed. My dad knows everything about airplanes. Daniel lowered his voice. Your dad knows enough to get embarrassed by his daughter. The woman across the aisle laughed softly. Daniel smiled, but his eyes returned to the window. Far below, the land changed from cities to open fields, then to long stretches of brown and green broken by rivers that looked like silver thread. He had made this route many times before. Only then he had traveled with Laura beside him, both of them carrying notebooks full of calculations and plans. Sterling Ridge had not just been a job. It had been the place where they believed they were building something that mattered. 8 years had passed, but memory had a way of ignoring calendars. Daddy, Emily whispered, why did you leave Montana? Daniel looked down at his hands. Because after your mom died, everything there reminded me of what I had lost. Emily was quiet. And now? He took a slow breath. Now I think maybe leaving also made me forget what she wanted me to protect. At 37,000 feet, hundreds of miles ahead of them, Victoria Sterling sat alone at a walnut table while Marcus Reed opened the old engineering report. Your father rejected 3 shutdown proposals, he said. Victoria turned another page. He was sentimental about that facility. Maybe. Marcus slid a photograph toward her. Daniel Hayes stood beside a younger woman in a hangar, both wearing safety glasses, an experimental engine behind them. Victoria studied the image. Who is she? Laura Hayes. His wife. Systems engineer. Where is she now? Marcus's voice softened. She died 8 years ago. Victoria stopped turning pages. And he left immediately after? Within 6 weeks. Victoria looked again at Daniel's handwritten correction beside a temperature graph. What did they build? Marcus leaned back. The prototype core your father believed could have changed the company. Victoria frowned. If it was that important, why did development stop? Because the final test failed. Then what does Daniel Hayes have to do with today? Marcus held her gaze. According to your father's private notes, Hayes knew the failure was not in the engine. Victoria's expression sharpened. Where was it? He never wrote it down. Silence filled the jet cabin. Victoria glanced toward the clouds outside. Find him. Marcus looked at the photograph again. We already did. She turned. Where? He checked the travel report on his tablet. Commercial flight. Economy cabin. Same destination. For the first time that morning, Victoria Sterling forgot about the shutdown documents in front of her. Victoria read the travel report twice. Daniel Hayes. Commercial flight. Same destination. No assistant. No reserve car. No corporate invitation. Just one man and a 10-year-old girl traveling toward a facility she intended to close before sunset. Why is he going there? She asked. Marcus Reed shook his head. We do not know. Then find out. His reservation was made 3 weeks ago. No company contact. No expense account. Nothing tied to Sterling Aerospace. Victoria looked through the oval window at the endless white clouds. For most of her career, uncertainty had been something she eliminated with data, lawyers, or money. Daniel Hayes did not fit neatly into any of those categories. What did my father write about him? Marcus opened another folder. Only fragments. Brilliant systems thinker. Difficult to replace. Refused management twice. Left after his wife died. Victoria frowned. That is all. Marcus hesitated. There is one sentence. Read it. He looked down. If Daniel ever comes back to Sterling Ridge, listen before you speak. Victoria's eyes lifted from the page. Her father had not been a sentimental man. He had built Sterling Aerospace by questioning everyone, trusting few people, and remembering almost every mistake made in his presence. Advice like that was not casual. When was that written? 9 days before he died. The cabin seemed quieter after that. Victoria closed the shutdown agreement and pushed it aside. Do not cancel anything yet. Marcus looked surprised. The board expects your signature this afternoon. They can expect it for another hour. Meanwhile, Daniel's flight began its descent toward Montana. The seatbelt light came on. Emily pressed both hands against the window. Beyond the glass, mountains rose under a wide blue sky, their upper ridges still holding patches of snow. You were right, she said. There are mountains everywhere. Daniel smiled. Almost everywhere. As the aircraft descended, Familiar landmarks appeared beneath them. A narrow river. A highway bending through open land. The old water tower near the edge of town. Then, farther west, a long gray roof surrounded by hangars and service buildings. Sterling Ridge. Daniel stopped smiling. Emily followed his eyes. Is that it? Yes. Where you and Mom worked? Yes. Does it look the same? Daniel watched the buildings grow larger as the airplane turned. Some places do not need to change to feel different. The wheels touched down with a low rumble. Several passengers applauded softly when the aircraft slowed. Emily laughed at them. Daniel did not. Through the window, he noticed a sleek private jet parked near the far side of the runway. Black tail, silver stripe, Sterling Aerospace emblem. He recognized it immediately. Someone important? Emily asked. Daniel reached for his backpack. Someone expensive. Minutes later, passengers moved through the small regional terminal carrying coats, rolling bags, and cups of coffee. Daniel and Emily stepped into the arrival area just as a private security door opened across the room. Victoria Sterling entered with Marcus and 2 assistants. Her cream coat was immaculate. Daniel's jacket was worn at the cuffs. Her team carried leather bags and legal cases. Emily carried a purple backpack with a broken zipper pull. For one brief second, Daniel and Victoria looked directly at each other. Neither spoke. Victoria recognized him from the photograph immediately. Daniel did not recognize her at all. Emily tugged his sleeve. Daddy, is that the lady from the airplane company? Daniel glanced toward Victoria. Maybe. Victoria started toward him, but her phone rang. One of her assistants stepped between them with a folder. The moment disappeared. Daniel took Emily's hand and walked toward the rental counters. Victoria watched him go. That is him, Marcus said quietly. She nodded. I know. Do you want me to stop him? Victoria remembered her father's handwritten warning. Listen before you speak. No, she said. I want to know where he is going. 20 minutes later, a black Sterling SUV left the airport toward the west. 5 minutes after that, Daniel and Emily followed the same highway in a compact rental car. They passed the same gas station, the same weathered church, the same sign welcoming travelers to Ridgefield, Montana. Victoria studied the town through tinted glass. Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel, while Emily counted horses in distant fields. 2 lives separated by money, history, and every assumption people made from appearances were now traveling the same road. And when the Sterling Ridge hangars finally appeared beyond the next hill, both vehicles turned toward the same gate. The security gate at Sterling Ridge recognized Victoria's vehicle before the guard even raised his hand. The black SUV rolled through without stopping. Daniel's compact rental car reached the same gate 5 minutes later and did not receive the same welcome. The guard stepped from the booth, looked at Daniel's faded jacket, then at Emily in the passenger seat. Facility is closed to visitors today. Daniel lowered the window. I am not here for a tour. Employee identification? I have not worked here in 8 years. The guard's expression hardened. Then you cannot enter. Emily looked from the guard to her father. Daniel remained calm. Call Samuel Grant in engineering. Sir, I cannot call department heads every time someone says they used to work here. Tell him Daniel Hayes is at the gate. The guard almost smiled. Daniel Hayes. Yes. The Daniel Hayes? Daniel paused. I do not know how many you had. The guard stared at him for another second, then reached for the phone. Inside the main administration building, Victoria walked through a hallway lined with framed photographs of aircraft, engines, and company milestones. Employees stood straighter when she passed. Some whispered after she moved beyond them. Everyone knew why she was there. By noon, Sterling Ridge could become a memory. Marcus walked beside her. The board is waiting by video conference. Let them wait. They will not like that. They will survive. At the end of the hallway, an elderly engineer stepped quickly from a laboratory door. Samuel Grant was 67, silver-haired, thin, and still wearing the same style of blue work shirt he had worn for decades. He barely noticed Victoria. His attention was fixed on the phone in his hand. Where is he? Marcus frowned. Where is who? Samuel looked toward Victoria. Daniel Hayes. Victoria stopped. He is here. At the front gate. Samuel was already moving. Then somebody better open it. 10 minutes later, Daniel stepped into Hangar 4 with Emily beside him. The smell reached him first. Machine oil. Cold metal. Old rubber. the faint electrical scent of equipment that had been powered on too many mornings before sunrise. He stopped just inside the doorway. Nothing moved for a moment. Then Samuel appeared from behind a workbench. You took your time. Daniel smiled for the first time since arriving. 8 years is not that long. Samuel embraced him briefly, then looked down at Emily. You must be Laura's girl. Emily nodded. Samuel's eyes softened. You have her eyes. Daniel looked away toward the far end of the hangar. Beneath a gray protective cover sat the prototype. The machine Laura had believed could change everything. Before Daniel could move toward it, heels clicked across the concrete floor behind him. Victoria entered with Marcus and 3 senior managers. Daniel turned. This time he recognized her. Not personally. From magazine covers, company reports, and the face attached to every decision made above his old pay grade. Victoria Sterling, he said. Daniel Hayes. Her eyes moved briefly toward Emily, then back to him. You traveled a long way for someone who no longer works here. So did you. One manager exchanged an uncomfortable glance with another. Victoria ignored it. I came to make a business decision. Daniel looked toward the covered prototype. So did I. You have no authority here. Maybe not. Then why are you here? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Emily stood beside him, listening. Samuel watched from several feet away. Daniel finally answered. Laura asked me to come back if Sterling Ridge was ever going to be closed. Victoria's expression shifted. Your wife? Yes. Why? Daniel walked toward the prototype and rested one hand on the edge of the gray cover. Because she knew the final test never proved this engine failed. Marcus stepped closer. That is not what the records say. Daniel looked at him. The records were wrong. Victoria crossed her arms. 8 years ago, the prototype shut down during full load testing. Temperatures exceeded tolerance, and the program was abandoned. I remember. Then what exactly are you claiming? Daniel lifted the cover. Dust moved through the pale hangar light. Beneath it sat the unfinished engine, cables disconnected, metal dulled by years of silence. Daniel studied it as if he had left only yesterday. The engine did what it was designed to do. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Then what failed? Daniel pointed toward the old control assembly mounted beside the test platform. That did. Samuel inhaled quietly. Marcus looked toward Victoria. One senior manager shook his head. Every engineering review cleared that system. Daniel nodded. Every review started with the same assumption. Which was? Victoria asked. Daniel turned toward her. That Laura and I had built the problem. The hangar fell silent. Victoria looked at the forgotten machine, then at the man who had crossed half the country on a cheap commercial ticket to stand beside it again. Can you prove that? She asked. Daniel's expression did not change. Give me one test. Victoria held Daniel's gaze for several seconds. The request sounded simple. One test. But everyone in Hangar 4 understood what stood behind those 2 words. If Daniel was wrong, the last argument for keeping Sterling Ridge alive would disappear with him. If he was right, 8 years of assumptions would collapse in a single afternoon. Marcus Reed broke the silence first. The board is expecting a closure vote in less than 2 hours. Daniel nodded. Then we should not waste time. One of the senior managers, Richard Sloan, folded his arms. This engine has been inactive for 8 years. You cannot walk in from an economy flight and expect us to restart a failed program because you remember it differently. Daniel looked at him. I am not asking you to trust my memory. Then what are you asking? Trust the data. Richard gave a small, skeptical laugh. Emily noticed. Her hand tightened around the strap of her purple backpack. Daniel did not react. Victoria did. Enough, she said. The room quieted. Samuel, what would it take to run a controlled diagnostic? Samuel Grant looked toward the prototype. If the control assembly is still intact, about 40 minutes to bring the monitoring systems online. Another 30 to verify the safety interlocks. Richard shook his head. This is a waste of time. Victoria turned toward him. Then you can afford 70 minutes. Daniel looked at her, surprised by the decision. She did not smile. You asked for one test. You get one. That is all I need. The old hangar began to wake around them. Technicians rolled equipment across the concrete floor. Monitors flickered to life. Cables were inspected, connectors cleaned, diagnostic stations powered on one by one. The air filled with the low hum of cooling fans and the soft clicks of relays. Daniel removed his jacket and folded it over a chair. Underneath, he wore a plain blue shirt. Nothing about him looked dramatic. that made the attention gathering around him feel even stranger. Emily sat near Samuel's workstation with a bottle of water and watched her father move through the test area. He touched almost nothing at first. He looked. He listened. He asked short questions. Original sensor package? Yes. Control software updated? Only security patches. Thermal feedback loop? Same architecture. 3 answers. 2 pages of old readings. Then Daniel stopped beside the control assembly. There. Samuel stepped closer. What? Daniel pointed toward a set of calibration values on the monitor. That offset should not be negative. Richard frowned. It has always been negative. Exactly. Daniel pulled up an archived test log. The temperature spike did not begin inside the engine. It began in the control system because this sensor correction pushed the feedback loop in the wrong direction. Marcus leaned toward the screen. Can you prove that? Daniel looked at Samuel. Set the offset to 0.4 positive. Richard immediately objected. That is outside the archived specification. Daniel met his eyes. The archived specification is why the test failed. Victoria watched him. Calm voice. No performance. No anger at the people who had dismissed him. Just certainty built from understanding. Samuel entered the new value. The diagnostic line shifted. One red warning disappeared. Then another. The room grew quieter. Daniel asked for a simulated load increase. The graph climbed. Stable. Another increase. Still stable. Richard stopped smiling. Victoria stepped closer to the monitor. How did nobody catch this? Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked toward an old clipboard hanging beside the workstation. Laura's handwriting was still faintly visible beneath years of dust. Someone did, he said. Samuel turned. Daniel lifted the clipboard carefully. Near the bottom, almost hidden beneath an old maintenance note, Laura had written 6 words. Check polarity before blaming thermal core. Emily stood from her chair. That is Mom's writing. Daniel nodded. His voice softened. Yes. Victoria stared at the note. 8 years of doubt, abandoned research, and a facility marked for closure had been sitting beneath a wrong assumption and 6 handwritten words. Daniel looked toward the engine. Now we run the real test. The real test began with less drama than anyone expected. Samuel Grant confirmed the calibration. 2 technicians checked the monitoring stations. Daniel stood beside the control console with one hand resting near the old clipboard that still carried Laura's handwriting. Victoria watched from several feet away, her arms folded, but the confidence she had carried into Sterling Ridge now looked different. More careful, more human. Ready? Samuel asked. Daniel looked toward Emily. She gave him a small nod. Ready. The system powered up in stages. Cooling pumps first, then control circuits, then the low mechanical hum of the prototype itself. Numbers appeared across the monitors in green and white. Temperature, pressure, flow rate, load percentage. Richard Sloan stood near Marcus with the expression of a man waiting for reality to restore the old conclusion. 20% load, Samuel said. Stable. 35. Stable. 50. No warning lights. Daniel did not celebrate. He watched the temperature curve. Victoria watched him. What are you looking for? She asked. A delay. In what? The correction response. 1 second passed. Then 2. The graph adjusted exactly where Daniel expected. There. Samuel leaned closer. Feedback is clean. Richard stepped toward the monitor. That does not prove full load stability. Daniel nodded. No, it does not. He looked at Samuel. Take it to 75. The hum deepened. Emily sat perfectly still. Around them, several employees had quietly gathered near the far edge of the hangar. Word had traveled quickly. The facility that had spent years preparing to be forgotten was suddenly listening to an engine everyone thought belonged to the past. 75%. Stable. 85. Stable. Victoria glanced at Marcus. He said nothing. 95. The temperature line climbed, leveled, then held. Richard's face changed. Daniel kept watching. Full load, he said. Samuel hesitated. You are certain? Daniel looked at Laura's note. Yes. Samuel entered the command. For several seconds, nobody moved. The prototype reached 100%. The numbers settled. No alarms. No shutdown. No thermal spike. Just a steady set of readings glowing across monitors that had once recorded failure. The hangar became so quiet that Emily could hear the soft rattle of an air vent above her. Samuel removed his glasses. Marcus slowly lowered the folder in his hand. Richard stared at the screen as if waiting for it to change its mind. Victoria stepped closer. How long can it hold? Daniel answered without looking away. If the cooling system is healthy, indefinitely within design limits. And 8 years ago, the control correction kept telling the system it was colder than it really was. The engine compensated for a problem that did not exist until the compensation created one. Victoria looked toward the prototype. So we abandoned the program because of one calibration error? Daniel finally turned to her. Not because of the error. Then why? Because once everyone decided the engine was the problem, they only looked for evidence that proved them right. The words landed quietly. Victoria understood they were no longer only talking about engineering. Her eyes moved toward the employees gathered along the hangar wall. Men and women who had spent years hearing that Sterling Ridge was obsolete. A facility judged by numbers before anyone came to see what remained inside it. Shut it down normally, Daniel said. Samuel nodded. The prototype eased back through the load stages until the hum softened and finally stopped. Nobody applauded at first. They simply stood there. Then an older technician near the back began clapping. Another joined him. Then another. Within seconds, the hangar filled with applause. Daniel lowered his eyes. Emily ran to him and wrapped both arms around his waist. Mom was right. Daniel placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Yes. Victoria watched them for a long moment before Marcus approached. The board is still waiting. She looked at the unsigned closure document in his hand, then at the engine, then at Daniel. Tell them the meeting has changed. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Changed how? Victoria took the closure papers, folded them once, and handed them back. We are no longer discussing how to shut Sterling Ridge down. She turned toward Daniel. We are discussing how to bring it back. The applause had barely faded when Victoria's phone began vibrating again. She looked at the screen, saw 3 missed calls from board members, then turned it face down on a workbench. Daniel noticed. They are not going to like waiting. Victoria looked toward the employees still gathered near the hangar wall. They have made this place wait 8 years. Marcus Reed stepped closer with the closure folder tucked beneath his arm. Victoria, proving the prototype works changes the engineering argument. It does not automatically fix the economics. I know. Restarting development could cost millions. I know. Richard Sloan crossed his arms. And one successful test does not create a market. Daniel finally spoke. No, but it creates a reason to look. Richard gave him a tired expression. You have been gone for 8 years. You do not know what this company needs now. Daniel nodded. That is true. The answer caught Richard off guard. Then why should anyone listen to you? Daniel looked toward the prototype. Because I am not asking you to build the company around my memory. I am asking you to stop making permanent decisions from an old mistake. The hangar quieted again. Victoria watched him carefully. He never pushed harder than necessary. He never needed to. What would you do first? She asked. Daniel turned toward her. Independent validation. Then, materials review, current manufacturing analysis, updated certification path, market comparison. How long? Long enough to do it right. Richard shook his head. That is not an answer. Daniel looked at him. It is the only honest one. Emily sat on a nearby stool, swinging her feet slowly as she listened. She had heard adults talk about money before. Rent, groceries, school supplies, plane tickets. But this was different. Here, money sounded like permission. Permission to keep people employed. Permission to remember something. Permission to decide whether her mother's work mattered. Victoria walked toward the hangar doors where late afternoon light stretched across the concrete. Beyond the windows, the Montana mountains stood blue and distant beneath a wide sky. Daniel, she said, why did you really come back? He looked at Emily before answering. Laura made me promise that if this place was ever going to disappear, I would come here once before it did. To save the engine? No, Victoria turned. Then what? Daniel's voice softened. To make sure I was not letting grief make the decision for me again. Nobody interrupted. He continued. When she died, I left because staying hurt. I told myself I was choosing Emily. Maybe I was. But I also chose silence because it was easier than fighting for something that reminded me of Laura every day. Emily looked up at him. Daniel met her eyes. I do not regret raising my daughter away from this place. I regret never coming back to finish the conversation. Victoria lowered her gaze. Marcus had known her long enough to recognize what she was thinking. Your father, he said quietly. She nodded once. He spent years trying to keep Sterling Ridge alive, and I called it sentiment. Daniel did not answer. Victoria looked toward the employees. Maybe I was doing exactly what you did. What is that? Daniel asked. Making a permanent decision because remembering someone was uncomfortable. For the first time, there was no CEO in her voice. Just a daughter. Marcus opened the closure folder. The board meeting starts in 6 minutes. Victoria took a breath. Then let us give them something worth discussing. She turned to Samuel. I want the test data prepared. To Marcus, she said, suspend every termination notice tied to Sterling Ridge. Richard stared at her. You cannot do that without board approval. Victoria looked at him. I can delay implementation. For how long? Long enough to know whether we nearly destroyed something valuable because nobody wanted to question an old conclusion. She turned back toward Daniel. I want you in the meeting. Daniel shook his head. No, Victoria blinked. Why not? Because I did not come here for a job. I am not offering one. Not yet. A small smile almost appeared on her face. Then come because you know something they need to hear. Daniel looked toward Emily. She nodded firmly. Go. He smiled. You sound like your mother. Emily smiled back. 20 minutes later, Daniel Hayes walked into the executive conference room beside Victoria Sterling, still wearing the same plain blue shirt he had worn beside the test stand. The board members on the screen expected a closure vote. Instead, Victoria placed the successful test results on the table and said, before anyone signs anything, you are going to listen to the man we should have listened to 8 years ago. The boardroom screens filled with 12 faces from offices across the country. Some looked irritated. Others looked confused. One man glanced at the clock before Victoria had even finished speaking. We were told this was a closure vote, he said. It was, Victoria replied. Then what changed? She placed the test report on the table. The facts. Daniel stood several feet away, hands relaxed at his sides. No jacket. No presentation. No title beneath his name. Richard Sloan sat near the end of the table, still visibly unconvinced. Marcus Reed opened the data file on the main screen. Green lines appeared where red warnings had once dominated the old records. The prototype completed a full load diagnostic without thermal instability, Marcus said. A board member leaned forward. After 8 years? Yes. Because of what? Victoria looked toward Daniel. Tell them. Daniel stepped closer to the table. The original shutdown was triggered by a calibration error in the control system. The engine compensated for incorrect temperature data until the compensation created the failure everyone blamed on the engine. Another board member frowned. And you are certain? The test repeated the corrected configuration. One test. Yes. That is not enough to justify reopening a facility. Daniel nodded. I agree. Several faces on the screens changed. They had expected resistance. Instead, he gave them restraint. Then what exactly are you recommending? The chairman asked. Daniel looked at the workforce numbers displayed beside the engineering results. Do not confuse proof of potential with proof of profit. Validate the design independently. Update the manufacturing model. Compare current materials costs. Review certification requirements. Then decide. Richard finally spoke. That could take months. Probably. And cost millions. Possibly. So your solution is delay? Daniel looked at him. My solution is knowledge. Silence followed. Victoria leaned back slightly, watching the room absorb the difference. The chairman folded his hands. Mr. Hayes, you left Sterling Aerospace 8 years ago. Why should we trust your judgment now? Daniel did not answer immediately. You should not trust me because I worked here. You should not trust me because Victoria asked you to listen. You should trust repeatable data, qualified engineers, and a process that allows people to be wrong before the company makes an irreversible decision. No one interrupted. 8 years ago, we did not do that, he continued. We found a result we feared and treated it like a conclusion. Today, you have a chance not to repeat it. One of the older board members looked down at the employee count. 380 people still work there? Marcus answered. Yes. And closure notices? Victoria spoke before anyone else could. Suspended. Richard turned toward her. Without approval. Temporarily. The chairman looked directly at Victoria. You are asking us to reverse course based on a test conducted this afternoon. No, she said. I am asking you to stop pretending the decision is still simple. That silenced even Richard. Victoria looked toward Daniel, then back to the screens. My father kept Sterling Ridge open because he believed there was unfinished work here. I assumed that belief was sentiment. Today I learned it was also evidence. The chairman studied her. What do you propose? Victoria took a breath. 90 days. Independent validation. No layoffs during review. Full technical audit. If the engine fails, we close with facts. If it succeeds, we build a recovery plan. One by one, the board members considered it. The vote was not unanimous. It did not need to be. 7 approved. 4 opposed. 1 abstained. Sterling Ridge had 90 days. Emily was waiting outside the conference room when Daniel emerged. Did you save it? She asked. Daniel crouched beside her. No, she looked disappointed. Then who did? He glanced through the glass wall toward the engineers gathering around the test data, then toward Victoria speaking quietly with Marcus. Nobody saves something like this alone. Victoria approached them a moment later. Your daughter has been asking my assistant how much private jets cost. Emily looked up innocently. I was curious. Daniel smiled. Victoria looked at him. I can have my plane take you both home tomorrow. Emily's eyes widened. Daniel considered the offer, then shook his head. We already have return tickets. Victoria almost laughed. Of course you do. He smiled. $110 each. She looked at him for a long moment. Then her expression softened. I spent $55 million on a machine that got me here faster. Daniel glanced toward the hangar beyond the windows. And Victoria followed his eyes. You still arrived before I understood why I was coming. 90 days later, Sterling Ridge no longer felt like a place waiting to disappear. The hangars were brighter. New diagnostic equipment stood beside old workbenches. Engineers who had spent months updating their resumes were back to arguing over test data and manufacturing tolerances. The independent review confirmed what Daniel had suspected. The prototype was viable. More importantly, the modernized design could be produced at a cost low enough to justify a limited restart. Victoria approved the recovery plan herself. No dramatic speech. No celebration in the boardroom. Just signatures, revised budgets, and 380 families learning that Friday would not be their last paycheck. Daniel returned to Montana twice during those 90 days. The first time, he helped Samuel review the updated control architecture. The second time, Emily came with him and spent an afternoon sitting beside engineers who told her stories about Laura. She learned that her mother had laughed loudly, written notes in the margins of everything, and once stayed until 2 in the morning because a temperature curve refused to make sense. For Daniel, those stories hurt less than they used to. That surprised him. Grief had not disappeared. It had simply stopped owning every room Laura had once entered. Victoria changed too. She began visiting Sterling Ridge without announcing it days in advance. Sometimes she walked the production floor with Marcus. Sometimes she sat with technicians during lunch. She asked more questions and gave fewer answers before hearing them. The employees noticed. So did Daniel. One afternoon, months after the final approval, Victoria found him outside hangar 4 watching Emily draw mountains in a small notebook. You know, she said, my pilots still think you are personally insulting them every time you refuse a ride. Daniel smiled. Your pilots will recover. You still fly economy? Usually. Even after all this. The seat gets there. Victoria looked toward the runway. Her private jet sat beyond the fence, polished and silent beneath the Montana sky. I used to think speed meant control. Daniel glanced at her. And now? She thought for a moment. Now I think arriving first does not matter much if you do not understand where you are. Emily looked up from her notebook. That sounds like something Dad would say. Victoria smiled. That is unfortunate. Daniel laughed. It was easy now. Not forced. Not careful. Later that evening, Sterling Ridge held a small gathering for the employees and their families. No investors. No press wall. No champagne tower. Just folding tables, barbecue, children running across the grass, and workers standing beside the people who had waded through months of uncertainty with them. Samuel presented Emily with a framed copy of Laura's handwritten note from the old clipboard. Check polarity before blaming thermal core. Emily read it, then looked at Daniel. Mom saved the engine. Daniel shook his head gently. She noticed something everyone else missed. Victoria stood beside them. Sometimes that is what saving something looks like. Emily hugged the frame against her chest. As the sun lowered behind the mountains, Victoria stepped away from the crowd with Daniel. I owe you something, she said. You already kept the facility open. That was not for you. I know. Daniel waited. Victoria looked back toward the families. I owe you thanks for making me slow down long enough to see what was in front of me. Daniel considered her words. Then keep doing that. She nodded. I am trying. Their shoulders nearly touched, but neither rushed the moment. That was not who they had become. Whatever was growing between them had started with disagreement, moved through respect, and only then found room for something warmer. Across the field, Emily called for her father. Daniel turned toward her immediately. Victoria smiled at that. He always did. The next morning, Daniel and Emily boarded another ordinary commercial flight home. Victoria could have sent the jet. She did not offer this time. From her office window at Sterling Ridge, she watched a small passenger plane rise into the clear Montana sky. Somewhere inside, Daniel sat beside his daughter with 2 inexpensive tickets and no need to prove anything to anyone. Victoria had arrived in Montana with more money, more power, and a faster aircraft. Daniel had arrived with a promise. In the end, both had reached the same place. Only one of them had known from the beginning what it was worth.